Senator Warner from Virginia is recognized from his office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate this committee's non-transitory, but relentless focus on this issue. And I would point out to my colleague, I spent a lot of time working with the former president's Treasury Secretary, Secretary Mnuchin, where we put about $5 trillion, $4.5 to $5 trillion under President Trump into COVID relief. We're talking about what's potentially driving inflation. I think those investments, I was proud to work with him on those investments, and I think they frankly saved this country from not only a recession, but potentially a depression. I want to come to a topic that a couple members have mentioned, but I don't think have drilled down in, and that's our housing shortage. We've seen rents go up 13.5% nationwide over the last year. Some markets, it's gone up 20%. We've seen home prices double over the last decade. A lot of this is frankly due to housing shortages. We now have a housing shortage of about 1.7 million units, and that grows by about 150,000 units each year. And everything I've heard, at least, is that shortage is particularly acute, not at the upper ends, not even on the rental side at the highest end rental, or it really is the most acute at low income housing. And that's one of the reasons why, working with the chairman and many of us on the committee, we had a robust housing package in the president's second part of his initiative that would have gone towards this supply issue. Because if you're looking at housing costs driving upwards of a third of CPI, and housing is a huge component of low and moderate income folks' basic nut they've got to meet each month. If we really want to take on systemically, and not in a transitory basis, but in a relentless basis, the question of inflation, we got to increase housing supplies. So, Dr. Bernstein, and I'd then be happy to hear from other members of the panel as well. What should we be doing on housing supply? And I was going to ask two questions. I'll try to ask just one, recognizing I'd like to get from the whole panel. Housing supply, won't that address it? Inflation won't happen overnight, but we've got this is a long-term problem that's been developing over a decade. And beyond just direct government programs, there are tax initiatives like LIHEAP and others LIHTC and others that I think make some sense. Private sector, been bipartisan supported. LIHTC gives that kind of incentive for low housing construction to developers. Shouldn't we use these in our toolbox if we're really going to take on, not in a short term, but in a long-term basis, inflation?
Yes, that is an extremely important set of questions. And let me begin by thanking you for your leadership on this work, and as well as others on the committee. Let me start by just saying why this is so important, underscoring some of the points that you made, Senator. There is a long-term supply shortfall in the housing sector, and you mentioned 150,000 units each year deficient supply. Multiply that by 10, and you get to the number that you're suggesting in terms of a shortfall. This is a market failure that's particularly acute in the bottom half of the market. And why? It's because the math doesn't always add up for people to build, for builders to build, along with the problem of exclusionary zoning problems. This makes this key to the president's equity agenda, especially in rural areas and communities of color. And the third issue you correctly raised was inflation. Shelter is the largest single component in the CPI. Housing experts Jim Parrott and Mark Zandi recently wrote, quote, "If policymakers are serious about reining in inflation, then they have little choice but to take on the shortfall in housing supply." What can we do? The administration is already actively using its executive powers to increase housing supply and access. We've coordinated with various agencies, Fannie, Freddie, HUD, Treasury, to create, deliver, or preserve 100,000 affordable units over the next 3 years. But the administration toolbox, Senator, as you well know, is not nearly big enough to deal with a supply shortage that goes back a decade at least. Investments that we make now will pay off for many years to come. Ideas that we've put on the table, many of which you've helped champion, have a long history of bipartisan support. And They involve the tax credits that help to incentivize building on the supply side, where too often middle and low-income housing doesn't pencil out given land, permitting, materials, and costs, again, which predated the pandemic. Resources to help build and renovate houses, and resources to build housing infrastructure through Community Development Block Grant, which includes action on exclusionary zoning. I can say more about any of those details. It would probably take a whole nother hearing to go through them in the way they deserve, but let me stop there for now.
And I think we've run out of time, so I would welcome any of my Republican colleagues who want to work with me on bipartisan tax policy that actually incents the increase of supply. If we don't want to take a transitory approach and we want to take a long-term approach to deal with inflation, we've got to increase the supply of housing, particularly for low and moderate income people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Warner.